We know that gang members commit a disproportionate amount of crime and harm in New Zealand.
It was revealed a Killer Bees member was behind the fatal shooting on Ponsonby Road on Sunday.
A brutal, random attack by a gangster on one of Auckland's busiest streets.
Police say they are disgusted by what they call senseless behaviour after 7 gun incidents spanning right across Auckland overnight.
The shootings are believed to be tit-for-tat strikes by members of the Killer Bees and tribesmen gangs. Bay of Plenty police have begun searching cars and homes of known gang members in Opotiki with a special warrant issued to deal with rising gang violence. In the latest incident on Saturday, a 20-year-old woman was shot and injured in her car.
The response from Police Commissioner Andrew Costa.
Today I'm announcing the establishment of a national gang unit and district gang disruption units to target crime, harm and intimidation caused by gangs.
And from the Police Minister Mark Mitchell.
Are going to be very effective in making sure that if a gang member or a gang pops their head above the parapet, then the police are going to have a strong response to deal with that.
And while some commentators are all for it,
Costa can call this whatever he likes if it keeps the gangs in check. It's a good idea.
All I can say is, hallelujah, it's about time. Finally, there is some good news. Finally, there's hope that we'll get to re-establish more than a modicum of control over the growing numbers of gangs and gang members.
many others who work in the sector or on the ground in communities are not on board.
The reality is this announcement hasn't come with money, it hasn't come with extra officers.
The announcement yesterday were rather vague. The only people that are going to be working in those units are going to be the experienced staff, and where they're going to take them from.
A crime unit might get people off the streets, fill up more prison beds, but you've got fourth generation mokopuna that are joining gangs now, and if we don't address the causes, the root causes, it will continue.
Kia ora, I'm Tom Kitchen, and today on The Detail, cops versus gangs. We're looking at a new approach from a new government. But is it the right approach? We talk to a journalist who spent 20 years covering the ins and outs of gangs and a former cop who's been on the front line. Jared Savage is an investigative reporter for the New Zealand Herald. For the last 3 to 5 years, he's written mainly about organised crime and has published a couple of books on it.
We've had gangs for a long time in New Zealand, decades, more than 50 years. Many of these young boys at that time, or young men, had been sort of come through the state care system, suffered a lot of trauma, and they were sort of banded together as a sense of brotherhood and sort of establishing them outside the norms of society.
And Lance Burdett is a former top cop, 22 years in the force, who rose to the rank of inspector and became the police's lead crisis negotiator. He spent a lot of his career dealing with gangs, especially in his early days out in Henderson and West Auckland.
If you look at what underlies gangs, so gangs in New Zealand, well, they started in the 1940s after the war. They were motorcycle clubs, and then it became gangs. In the 60s, it was all to do with the drift from the rural into urban. So it was that urban drift and a collection of people coming together. So some of the gangs are actually ethnic based. They are almost family whānau. That's what they're about, right? But they have to make money. And once you start breaking the law, the money stops and all that sort of things happens. And so you have to, how are you going to generate funds? They can't go and do fundraisings. So they go into crime to fund the gang.
As the years went on and the decades went on, there was a lot of quite bad sort of violence against each other, both between rival gangs, but also against women. We saw some pretty bad group rapes and things like that sort of in the 80s and 90s. I would sort of describe gangs at that point as operating outside the norms and rules of society, deliberately so, that they feel like they've been outcast. I guess what we saw, and where I've kind of had a bit more sort of involvement in reporting on gangs, is sort of the introduction of methamphetamine in the late 90s, early 2000s, really kind of supercharged the criminal underworld in which gangs sort of belong to. And meth became a very popular drug. Lots of money could be made by it. This is 20 years ago, early 2000s. We started seeing gang members with flash motorbikes and flash cars and going on holidays and nice homes and things like that. But then sort of around about 2015, we started seeing a bit of a sea change. It wasn't just sort of local gang members and local organised crime figures working together locally to import drugs into the country. We actually started seeing, organised crime groups reaching into New Zealand, if that makes sense. And that kind of tied in with the arrival of sort of a new breed of gang members coming in from Australia, the likes of the Comancheros, the Mongols, the rebels. Many, senior members have been deported from Australia under the Immigration Act, Section 501.
Australia's sent thousands of Kiwis back since 2015 after controversial changes were made to Section 501 of its Migration Act. Newshub can reveal they've been convicted of more than 8,000 offences in New Zealand since 2015.
They had true international organised crime connections, and New Zealand all of a sudden became another sort of target for much larger shipments of drugs. So 20 years ago, a kilogram of meth being cooked in here in New Zealand was a big story. That'll be front page news in the Herald and on Radio New Zealand bulletins.
A man is to appear in court on firearms charges following the discovery of his loaded semi-automatic weapon in a crashed car in South Auckland this morning. County's Manukau police say a plastic bag containing just over 1 kilogram of a methamphetamine-like powder was also found in the vehicle and has been sent off for testing.
Now, I'd say every low-level drug dealer running around the country would have at least 3 or 4 kilos in the boot of their car. And as a result, the police and customs and other law enforcement have had to lift their game too.
So it's become a lot more sophisticated over time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, part of that too is changes in technologies. So, 15, 20 years ago, everyone was carrying, Nokia handheld cell phones around, and criminals were too, and they were communicating via text messaging and phone calls, because obviously that was a lot more mobile than just, ringing ringing the landline. The police were able to intercept, these text messages and phone calls, and even if criminals were dealing in code, the police would over time be able to work out what they were actually talking about and present that as evidence. Well, we see the introduction of smartphone technology and apps on people's phones, different ways of communicating. I mean, most people don't send text messages anymore. They send Facebook Messenger or WhatsApp, and many other apps that are out there which are encrypted end to end. So the police can't intercept those like they used to be. They can't listen to them or read them live, and that's made it a lot harder to investigate these different groups. It's a lot harder to get the evidence needed to bring down a big case these days. So the police sort of change their methods, and it becomes a game of cat and mouse between the criminal world and sort of the covert investigation world that the police operate in. So they've gone back to bugging houses, bugging cars, physical surveillance. If they do a warrant or a raid on a house, they can seize phones, and then just customs have quite a good electronic sort of investigation team where they can crack. They're quite good at cracking security on a phone. So if they can get into the phone, then they can, retrieve messages and then sort of backfill that as evidence as well.
Early on in my career, I started out at Henderson Police Station, where there was a lot of interaction with gangs, as it turns out. I mentioned Henderson Police Station because there was a detective there who was very good at liaising with, and they used to have what was called a gang liaison officer, who would actually meet with the gangs on a regular basis to sort of, I guess, befriend them a little bit, but more around intelligence gathering. And, here's the right and wrong, and this is, but setting up a whole sort of communication network, very helpful when things got a little bit sketchy between gangs and police. He would go in there and settle things down and say, well, you're breaking the law. And I was involved in executing a search warrant it was the Headhunters in Henderson Valley Road. And they had the big gates, steel gates up, and the gang liaison officer would bang on the door and say, we've got a warrant, I've got it in my hand, you can either open the door or we're coming in anyway, whether you open the door or not. And next thing the door opens up, right? Because they know that they're just going to police are going to get something to push through because they're going to come in. And so just having that peaceful way of entering properties and having that liaison with people, and him to be able to go off and sit off with the people off to the side and say, this is what's happening, to clarify what's happening. That to me looked like a pretty ideal model.
There is an important distinction to be made between overt public policing and covert policing, which is happening, literally under the cover of darkness. And there has been a lot more, as a result of what we talked about earlier about this, there's new gangs coming in. There's been an increase in membership of the existing gangs. There's a lot of conjecture around the numbers of gang members, but, different political parties at different times have claimed that, gang members have increased by thousands of members, doubled, from sort of 4,000 to 7,000. There's some conjecture around the methodology of how those numbers are counted, but I mean, without doubt, there's definitely been a very large increase in the numbers of gang members, and as a result, there's been a lot more pretty high-profile incidents in the last few years, in particular, between rival gangs. And of course, with that comes the political aspect of it as well. And we're seeing that right now. Obviously, National Act and New Zealand First campaigned on, getting tougher on gangs and cracking down, and accusing the previous Labour government of being soft on crime and soft on gangs. And of course, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle as well. So yeah, that's led to what we've seen just last week with the establishment of the so-called National Gang Unit, which Commissioner Costa and the Police Minister says will be dedicated resources to cracking down on gangs in various parts of the country.
It's not like the gang issue has been ignored over the years.
When Labour and New Zealand First came into power, sort of 2017, 2018, and that coalition government, one of their promises was to increase numbers of police by about 1,800, and a huge proportion of the 1,800, about 700 from memory, was staff dedicated resource for fighting organised crime, because there was this recognition that organised crime was on the rise, and the Labour NZ government put resources into that to help the police combat it, because it was a pretty big deal. Now, whether or not the police got an extra 1,800 is debated, but I guess the point is at that time, you had a Labour minister in charge, Stuart Nash, who actually did believe in the police. He was a big cheerleader, and he liked being the police minister. And then following that, when Labour was elected in 2020 with a full majority, they could govern by themselves. We had a new police minister come in, Portal Williams, who, to my mind, didn't seem to really be that invested in the police portfolio. I don't think she was that sort of across it. It was around about that time, and this is coincidental to her being in charge, but around about that time, this is when we started seeing a lot more of these shootings, a lot more of these big gang convoys. We had about 3 weeks of tit-for-tat sort of fire bombings and drive-by shootings between the Killer Bees and the tribesmen.
The Killer Bees used to be a feeder gang for the tribesmen, but police say there's been historic tensions between them.
That really ratcheted it up. There was a lot of media pressure reporting on it, leading to the police. They launched Operation Tauwhiro, which was sort of designed to essentially be focused on seizing and collecting as many illegal firearms as possible. That led on to Operation Cobalt, which was sort of a precursor to this National Gang Unit that was seen here. So that was sort of the police districts were tasked with, creating teams to focus on gang members. And we saw some good results out of that as well.
One News can tonight exclusively reveal that the specialist police team set up to crack down on gangs has arrested thousands of people in the 12 months it's been operating.
Tauwhiro and Cobalt, kind of more targeting, I wouldn't say lower level stuff, but more kind of local criminality, like the big things I've been talking about before, the big COVID investigations. That's at a very high level, which we don't often see. This was more kind of, the lower hanging fruit that kind of was still causing a lot of harm in the communities. But Minister Williams essentially got the sack from Jacinda Ardern during that time as she got reshuffled out of the police portfolio. So the parachuted Chris Hipkins in there. He did a lot more work in that police portfolio. Labour put through some new laws to help target gangs. And of course, now with the new government, National Act and New Zealand First, all campaigning as sort of being tougher on crime, law and order parties. We've seen an escalation of that with the legislation that they're proposing to bring in to crack down on gangs.
What are they looking at bringing in?
We've got the gang patch ban in public.
As the government looks to ban gang patches in public...
Which one of the T-shirts that I'm wearing is related to Black Power?
We've got dispersal orders, so often, large gatherings of gang members can be intimidating to the public or lead to problems. So these dispersal notices can be issued to gang members, which would mean they have to immediately leave the area and then not sort of associate with one another for a week. I think they're proposing to bring in an anti-consorting law, which would mean particular gang members would be unable to associate with one another for several years. We've got these beefed up firearms prohibition orders coming in. Anyone convicted of a serious offence involving drugs and firearms or kind of organised crime-related offences.
Do you feel like it's more political posturing, Jared, them doing this, or do you think this is actually going to change things for the better?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, and there's good arguments on both sides of it. I do, like, for example, the gang patch ban. People are genuinely intimidated by seeing people wearing patches, walking down the street, kind of gathering around. I think personally that this will help a lot of people to feel less intimidated by it if there's seen to be the patch ban. I think the patch ban will lead to people feeling safer. They might feel that they're going to feel safer. I don't know whether they will actually be any safer, but they will feel safer.
Back to Lance Burdett with his thoughts on the latest policies and police initiatives.
The thing about the gangs today is they collude with each other, they collaborate with each other, and it's very hard to identify their networks. They also network internationally. And so it's great to disrupt people by saying, let's ban gang patches. That makes the community feel safe. But what it's done, and particularly in Australia, I've read some research that drives it underground, so you don't know who is now a gang member. So that's the problem you have when you push something underground. A couple of things happen. When you ban something, there's usually a bit of a bounce back, right? There's a reflex action. It's a natural rebound that happens. And plus, doing something like that entices people that wouldn't ordinarily join a gang because it's that whole mystique around it. For a while, I was with the Auckland Central Intelligence Unit, so part of that is monitoring gang movements and what was going on. And so whenever a police officer sees a gang member patched up, or they put a noting form through, it's called, and that gathers intelligence as to where people are moving, who's moving around the city, and you collate all that. And that's good information, right? So straight away, if they aren't wearing patches on their bikes or in their cars, you can't see them moving around. So you're going to lose that vital information as to who's going where and why. Not to say that they wouldn't be putting a coat over there. They can do that these days, but they're proud of their patch, and so they wear it. And that's information that's valuable for police as to who's doing what, some identification, and it builds up a picture of numbers.
The gang unit's not necessarily a big new flash thing. I mean, it's not like we haven't seen this before.
No, it's just different names, different areas. It's exactly the same thing. In fact, it's policing in general.
Yeah.
If there's a crime, there's a certain group you want to target, there's a unit set up for that. It's virtually almost like a homicide inquiry, right? So a group of people come together, detectives, they get specialised in a certain area and they just work. They used to have robbery squads, they used to have all sorts of squads. We've seen all these things come and go. Not to say that they shouldn't do it. I mean, let's face it, gangs bring terror and real terror. And I mean, they cause harm and they need to be dealt with. Because and also it's not just in the community, it's also in prisons where that gangs are recruited. So you can't just say it's in the public. You have to follow through in all areas of criminal justice.
And I guess if you have to put all the resources into that, you're going to miss out on something else.
Unless they are ring-fenced and unless you've got a particular group that aren't allowed to be touched. I've heard the term ring-fencing a lot in my career. The ring fencing doesn't last for long. There's always something that comes with a higher priority.
But yeah, there's gang units. Do you think it's more kind of
political gesturing then? If it's been done before, is it just a headline that the politicians want?
I'd like to say no. I'd like to say that it's something that should be ongoing. Right, it should be. Because particularly some of the real nasty gangs out there are doing major harm. It has to be said. They are destroying people's lives, absolutely destroying them, and that must stop. I'm sort of leaning towards the left when it comes to prisons and things. I like to think people can be rehabilitated. However, there's some people that cannot be rehabilitated, and for serious crime, there must be people held to account for it.
So, yeah, if you kind of had an ideal policing strategy over this, what else would you have?
So what's the underlying cause of gangs? Is it money that drives it? Is it a sense of belonging that drives it? Have we done any work on that? Because oftentimes it's a bit like a form of radicalisation, I guess. Gangs, they are radicalised into it, but people want to belong. They have to have a feeling of belonging. And so when they are disrupted in their family, in their whānau, for various reasons, whether there's sexual abuse, whether there's whatever it might be, the family becomes dysfunctional. And so the child has to have a sense of belonging. So if they find somebody who's, hey, come and join us, we've got this group over here, we're drawn to it because humans need a sense of belonging. The disruption, great, let's start with that. But what drives it? What underlies it? Children is what I'm talking about. Can we support them at an earlier age so that they don't get tied up with these things, that they're not drawn to it?
Is it the police's job to do that?
No, it's not the police. It's multifaceted, right? We're looking here at health. We're looking at social welfare. We're looking at all sorts of things. Multifaceted. It has to be. Police is the end of the road, isn't it?
What can be done to keep people out of gangs? Well, probably having something else for them to do growing up would be good, whether that's sports or youth groups or jobs or working, education. It's not really people from middle, upper class backgrounds joining gangs. It's people who are searching for something missing in their lives, but also some of these guys like the notoriety that comes with it. They like the money that can be made from it.
Well, what's the end goal here, Jared? Do you think our aim should be to get rid of gangs, or do you think it should just be to stop the criminality aspect of them?
We're never going to get rid of gangs in their entirety. In certain parts of New Zealand, it's part of the fabric of the community in many regards. Many people have family members who are gang members. So it's kind of like we're not going to get rid of them. I think there would be some sort of utopia that can't be achieved unless we eliminated all those social problems that are sort of mentioned before. We don't really want people joining these groups. So anything that can be done within our communities to help that end is something that needs to be supported. What's the end game for police? Well, they probably just want New Zealand. I think the stated aim of the police is for New Zealand to be the safest country in the world. And that probably is something that is more likely to be achievable. The proof will be in the pudding in 5 years' time, and we kind of see what kind of impact it's having.
That's it for today. The Detail is supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was engineered by Blair Stagbull. It was produced by Alexia Russell and Davina Zimmer. Thanks to Jared Savage and Lance Burdett. I'm Tom Kitchen. Mā te wā.